Emotional exhaustion rarely begins in adulthood. It usually takes root much earlier, in moments where a child learned quietly and without guidance that their feelings were inconvenient or unsafe. When emotional needs are consistently unmet, the psyche adapts. It learns endurance instead of expression, responsibility instead of rest. Over time, this adaptation becomes a personality trait. The adult does not recognize it as exhaustion. They recognize it as normal life. From a psychological perspective, this is not a failure of character, but a triumph of survival. The mind does what it must to remain functional in an environment that does not allow vulnerability. Many emotionally exhausted adults were praised for being mature, strong, or selfless at a young age. What was rewarded was not health, but self-erasure. The nervous system learned to stay alert, to carry emotional weight alone, and to expect little in return. As Jung would suggest, what is repressed does not disappear. It waits. Emotional fatigue is often the return of what was postponed for decades. The body grows tired of carrying what the voice was never allowed to say. The question, then, is not why you are exhausted, but how long you have been surviving instead of living. One of the most misunderstood aspects of emotional exhaustion is how well it hides. Many adults who are deeply fatigued are not falling apart. They are functioning at a high level. They meet deadlines, care for others, remain composed, and rarely ask for help. This outward stability becomes a psychological mask, one that convinces both the world and the individual themselves that everything is under control. But beneath this competence lies a growing inner depletion. Jung spoke of the persona as the face we present to society. For the emotionally exhausted adult, this persona becomes overdeveloped. It is polished, dependable, and efficient, but it comes at a cost. The more energy invested in maintaining this outer image, the less remains for inner life. Emotions are managed rather than felt. Pain is intellectualized rather than processed, and silence becomes the preferred response to inner conflict. This divide creates a quiet suffering. The individual begins to feel strangely empty, disconnected from joy, yet unable to stop performing. Functionality replaces vitality. The danger is not collapse, but numbness. A life lived correctly, yet without depth. When your outer strength is built on inner neglect, exhaustion is not a warning. It is an invitation to reclaim your whole self. Emotional exhaustion often persists not because the adult is unaware, but because the behaviors causing it once served a vital purpose. Overgiving, constant availability, and self-sacrifice are rarely random habits. They are survival strategies formed in environments where being needed meant being safe, and where saying no risked rejection or conflict. The psyche learned that worth was earned through usefulness. From a Jungian perspective, these patterns become unconscious complexes, automatic responses that operate long after the original danger has passed. The adult continues to live as though emotional security depends on pleasing others, fixing problems, or carrying responsibilities that are not theirs. What once ensured belonging now quietly drains vitality. This survival mindset keeps the nervous system in a state of vigilance. Rest feels uncomfortable. Boundaries feel selfish, and stillness feels undeserved. The individual may intellectually understand the cost, yet emotionally feel trapped by an invisible obligation. Exhaustion becomes the price paid for acceptance. The tragedy is that these patterns often persist even in safe relationships, because the psyche has not updated its map of reality. Healing begins when awareness replaces automaticity, when the adult recognizes that survival is no longer the goal. You do not need to earn your right to exist. You need to learn how to live without constantly defending it. As emotional exhaustion deepens, something subtle but profound begins to fade: the connection to the inner self. The adult still thinks, plans, and performs, but feels increasingly distant from their own emotional life. Joy becomes muted, desire feels confusing, and even rest can produce guilt instead of relief. This is not indifference, it is disconnection. The psyche, overwhelmed for too long, begins to numb what it cannot safely express. Jung understood this as a loss of contact with the inner world. When emotions are repeatedly suppressed, the individual learns to live from the intellect alone. Feelings are analyzed rather than experienced, and intuition is replaced with obligation. Over time, the person forgets what they want, only knowing what is expected of them. Life becomes efficient but hollow. This inner absence often shows up as restlessness, chronic dissatisfaction, or a vague sense that something essential is missing. The tragedy is not the exhaustion itself, but the gradual disappearance of authenticity. Without emotional access, the self becomes a role rather than a living presence. Reconnection does not begin with dramatic change, but with honest listening, allowing emotions to surface without judgment or correction. When you reclaim your inner voice, energy returns naturally. If you cannot feel your life, no amount of success will make it feel complete. Many emotionally exhausted adults attempt to heal by resting more, sleeping longer, taking breaks, or stepping away temporarily from responsibility. While rest is necessary, it is often insufficient. Exhaustion of this kind is not simply physical, it is psychological and relational. When a person returns from rest to the same patterns of self-betrayal, the fatigue quickly reappears, often with greater intensity. From a Jungian lens, the problem lies not in effort, but in unconscious repetition. The adult continues to live according to internal rules formed long ago. Always be available, avoid conflict, suppress needs, stay useful. Rest without awareness becomes a pause, not a transformation. The psyche recovers just enough to resume the same draining behaviors. True healing begins with insight, the willingness to observe one's own patterns honestly, without justification or shame. This awareness allows the individual to recognize where they abandon themselves for approval or peace. Emotional exhaustion lifts not when life becomes easier, but when inner conflict is reduced. Energy is reclaimed when the psyche no longer has to split itself to survive. This is why rest alone fails. It treats the symptom, not the cause. Awareness changes the cause. If you keep returning to the life that exhausted you, rest will never be enough to save you. Recovery from emotional exhaustion does not arrive through force or discipline, but through integration. The adult begins to heal when they stop dividing themselves into what is acceptable and what is hidden. Boundaries are not walls, they are acts of psychological truth. Each boundary says, "This is where I end and where I choose myself." For many exhausted adults, this feels unfamiliar and even threatening because their identity was built on availability rather than authenticity. Jung emphasized that wholeness emerges when unconscious material is brought into awareness and lived consciously. In practical terms, this means learning to say no without justification, to rest without guilt, and to express needs without apology. These are not behavioral tricks, they are internal realignments. As the inner world becomes more honest, the outer life reorganizes naturally. Energy returns not because demands disappear, but because the psyche is no longer in constant conflict with itself. The adult no longer spends energy maintaining a false self or suppressing emotional truth. What once felt exhausting begins to feel clear and deliberate. This is the quiet transformation most people never see. Exhaustion giving way to presence, and survival giving way to choice. When you live in alignment with your inner limits, strength stops draining and starts to grow.